Good morning, all of you. And after a long gap, we are live again. So join us as soon as possible so that I can start my class. Good morning to Sabnam, Priya, and to all those who are joining the live classes of the civils. In the previous class, we have discussed about the Regulating Act 1773, then Pitt's India Act, Bengal Judicature Act. Apart from that, we have also discussed about the Act of 1786, which is very important. Okay. Now, the next is the Charter Act 1793. Okay. The Charter Act. The Charter Act 1793. Okay. Now, there are only 2 or 3 provisions which are very important for your examination. Okay. The first provision of this charter was the Charter of 1793 extended the trade privileges, of company for next 20 years. Okay, 20 years. We all know the company in the Charter of 1600, the company got trading rights or trade monopoly rights for 15 years. Okay. The Charter Act of 1793 extended the charter of company for the further next 20 years. Okay. So this was the first and the most important provision of this Charter Act 1793. This is very important. Okay. Now, the next important provision of this. A code was formulated. Okay. A code was framed. A code was framed. Why it was framed? A code was framed for all legislation. Okay. For all legislation. A code was framed for all legislation. Okay, for all laws. Okay, a code was framed for all regulation that could be enacted. That could be enacted in Bengal or by Bengal presidency. So this is the second most important provision. A code was enacted or framed, not enacted, a code was framed for all legislation that could be enacted in Bengal. Okay. So this was, so all laws which was passed, which could be enacted in Bengal, that laws, okay, all the laws, for all the laws that could be enacted in Bengal, for that a code was framed. Okay, so this was the second provision. Okay, now the third provision was, look here, before this Charter Act 1793, okay, the salaries of the home government means we all know by 1784 a board of control was formed. Okay, so board of control, it was formed in Britain. Okay, by Act of 1784. We all know about that. So prior to this act, the salaries of all the members of the Board of Control or home government, okay, was paid from the exchequer of Britain. Exchequer means the treasury of Britain. Okay, but now by this act it was made that, okay, what made by this act it was made that all the salaries, okay, all the members of the home government, okay, were in future to be paid salaries not from the British exchequer or the British treasury, but from Indian treasury. So this was also the most important provision. Okay, now, so the third provision was, okay, all members in home government. Home government means the Board of Control. Okay, here is what? Board of Control, which was established by the Pitt's India Act 1784. All members in home government, okay, all members in home government were in future to be paid salary, to be paid salaries not from the exchequer of Britain, but from the revenue of India. Okay, state checker, but out of the Indian revenue, but out of the Indian revenue. Okay, Indian revenue. So this was the third important provision. Earlier, the salaries of the members of home government were paid from the exchequer of Britain or exchequer of Britain or treasury of Britain. But, okay, this act clearly mentioned that the members in future would be paid from Indian revenue. Okay, I hope it is clear to all of you. Before this act, now again I am repeating the same line. Before the passage of this act, the home government, the member of home government means those who were the member of Board of Control. We all know this Board of Control was formed in 1784 by the Pitt's India Act. It has 6 members. Okay, and all the members were nominated by Crown. Okay, and they were the member of British Parliament. The member of Board of Control were the member of British Parliament. Okay, so this Charter Act of 1793 clearly mentioned that the members of all members of this home government in future would be paid from the Indian revenue, not from the revenue of Britain. Okay, so it is clear. Good morning to all of you. So these are the 3 main provision of the Charter Act. First provision is that this act, okay, extended the charter of company for the next 20 years. Okay, means the license was renewed for the 20 years, because we all know by the charter of 1600 the East India Company got trade monopoly, okay, trade monopoly to trade with Eastern world. Okay, so by different charter this license was extended, and the Charter Act 1793 extended the trade charter or the trade privileges of the company for further 20 years, further period of 20 years. Okay, and the second provision was a code was framed. Okay, so all laws which was enacted in Bengal, okay, enacted in Bengal, for that laws a code was formed, and from here the codification of act laws was, this was the beginning of the codification of law. Okay, and by this act, okay, and the third provision of this act was, before this passage of act, passage of Charter Act 1793, all the members of home government, okay, were paid from the British Exchequer or the state exchequer or the revenue of Britain. But this act clearly mentioned that in future all the salaries of all the members of home government would be paid from Indian revenue. Is it clear to all of you, these three provisions? Good morning to all of you. Now tell me, these all points or provision of Charter Act, is it clear to all of you? Is it clear to all of you? I want answer from all of you. Okay, now I am moving to the next Charter Act 1813. Okay, the Charter Act of 1813. The Charter Act of 1813. Now, this act is very important. Okay. Now, the first provision of this act was, this act extended the charter of company for the next 20 years. 20 years, but ended, very important line, but ended the trade privileges of East India Company. Okay, ended the trade privileges, okay, trade monopoly, okay, ended the trade privileges means ended the trade monopoly, of East India Company. Here is what? East India Company, trade monopoly of East India Company, okay, with India, okay, extended the charter of company for the next 20 years, but ended the trade monopoly or trade privileges of East India Company with India. Okay, it however retained retained the trade retained the trade monopoly of tea and trade with China. This is very important. Trade monopoly of tea and trade monopoly in tea and trade with China. This is very important. First of all, the first point is it extended the charter of company for the next 20 years. Means the license was renewed and permitted for the next 20 years. Okay? But ended the trade monopoly. This line is very important of East India Company with India, because we all know by the Charter of Act of 1600, the company got the trade monopoly rights to trade with Eastern world. Okay? So this act ended the trade privileges or trade monopoly of East India Company with India. Okay? But it retained the trade monopoly. Okay? In trade of tea, in tea trade, and trade monopoly in tea trade and trade with China. This is very important. Means apart from these two trades, okay, trade of tea and trade with China, okay, on these 2 points, okay, trade with China and tea trade, on both this there was a monopoly of East India Company. Otherwise, all the privileges, apart from these two privileges, all the privileges of the East India Company was abolished by this Charter Act. Okay? Now, the next point is Indian trade was thrown open. Earlier, only East India Company were allowed to trade with India. But now, what happened? After the passage of this act, Indian trade was thrown open for all Britishers. Okay? Thrown open to all Britishers. Thrown open to all Britishers. Only before this act, only the East India Company had a trade monopoly. No other European companies or the nationalists of Britain were allowed to trade with India. But by this act, what happened? The trade monopoly rights of East India Company was abolished, but they retained the trade monopoly in trade of tea trade and trade with India. They retained this. Okay? Now, since the trade monopoly ended, okay, what happened? This act permitted all the Britishers, all the companies of Britishers to trade with India. Okay? So, Indian trade was thrown open to all Britishers. Okay? Now, the third important point is the third important and very, very important point of this act was this act declared the sovereignty of crown, over the territory of East India Company. Okay. This Charter Act declared the sovereignty of Crown over the territory of East India Company acquired in India. Okay. So all the territories which were under East India Company, okay, after the passage of this act clearly mentioned, explicitly declared that the sovereignty of Crown over the territory of East India Company. Okay, all the territories which were acquired by all the territories of East India Company, all the areas which were occupied by East India Company in India were the sovereignty of Crown was established over that. So this was the third most important, okay, declare provision of this Charter Act. Okay, I hope it is clear. This act explicitly declared the sovereignty of Crown over the territories of East India Company acquired in India. Okay, this is very important. Okay, now the next was by this act the Christian missionaries, okay, by this act the Christian missionaries were permitted to go to India and to settle there. Okay, for the propagation of Christian missionaries, for the propagation of Christianity, the Christian missionaries were allowed, means they were given license. Okay, the Christian missionaries were allowed to go to India and settle there to propagate Christianity. Okay, and this was done by a license. So the government started giving license to the Christian missionary to go to India and settle there for the propagation of Christianity. Okay, so this was the third main provision. Okay, now the fifth provision was by this act, we all know, I have discussed in detail, by the act of 1830, first time 1 lakh rupees was allotted by British Parliament, 1 lakh rupees yearly, not less than 1 lakh, for the promotion of education in India. We all know about that. Okay, I have discussed in detail. So this was the fifth major provision of this act. The first provision was that this act extended the trade monopoly rights of East India Company for further 20 years. Okay, but ended the trade privileges of East India Company. Okay, ended, but still the company reserved. Okay, but still one thing was there in this provision, the trade monopoly. Okay, the monopoly rights in trade of tea and trade with India was intact with company. Okay, the second provision was, since the trade monopoly was ended, so all Britishers were allowed, given permission to trade with India. Earlier, only East India Company was allowed to trade with India. Okay. The next provision was, this was the first act passed by the British Parliament that clearly declared the sovereignty of Crown over the territories of East India Company acquired in India. This act is also known as Helena Act, St. Helena Act. Helena Act. Okay, because St. Helena, which is an island, it was also acquired by the East India Company. Okay, so the sovereignty of Crown was also established over St. Helena Island. That's why this act is also known as Helena Act. Okay, I hope it is clear. Apart from that, by this act, the Christian missionaries were permitted, were licensed to go to India and settle there. And the purpose of this provision was the expansion of Christianity. Okay, and the next provision was, by this act, the first time British Parliament, okay, allotted rupees 1 lakh rupees yearly, decided to allot rupees 1 lakh yearly for the promotion of education in India. Okay, now the next important point was, this act, by this act declared that approval of all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras. Okay, approval of all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency were made all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency were made mandatory to be okay. So this was, so approval of all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency were made mandatory by this act. The approval of all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency were made mandatory from from British Parliament. So this was the next important, okay, provision. Approval of all the laws which was passed from this Bombay and Bengal presidency, okay, that law would be approved by British Parliament. So this was the next most important provision of this Charter Act. So approval of all the laws passed by Bengal, Bombay and Madras presidency were made mandatory from British Parliament. Okay, so all the laws which was passed, okay, in future, all the laws which was passed from all the laws which was passed from Bengal, Bombay and presidency had to approved, okay, from British Parliament. So this was the next important and the most one of the important provision of the Charter Act 1813. Okay, so these all were the provisions of Charter Act 1813. Now, so I hope it is clear to all of you. Is it clear to all of you? I want answer. Is it clear to all of you? The provisions of Charter Act 1813? I want answer from all of you. So this was the provision. Okay. Now, the next is the Charter Act 1833. The Charter Act 1833. Now, the Charter Act 1833. Now, look here. The first provision was this act, the Charter Act 1833, okay, extended the extended the trade monopoly rights of East India Company for the next Charter of East India Company, extended the Charter of East India Company for the next 20 years. Next 20 years. Okay. Now, so this is also important because after this act, this provision was scrapped because in the next Charter Act 1853, this line was missing. Okay. So the extension of this act extended the Charter of East India Company for the next 20 years. Okay. Ended the monopoly, ended the trade monopoly of East India Company in trade of tea and trade with China. Okay, ended the trade monopoly of East India Company in trade of tea, because we all know by the Act of 1813, okay, the trade monopoly of East India Company was abolished, but at the same time the company were successfully retained the monopoly in trade of tea and trade with China. These two privileges which was maintained by the Act of 1813 was scrapped. Okay, so this act ended the trade monopoly of East India Company, okay, in trade of tea as well as trade with China. Okay, now apart from this, the other important provision was the Europeans. By this act, the Europeans were allowed. Europeans, earlier European word was missing. Europeans were allowed to acquire property. Okay, they were allowed to acquire property in India. Okay, so this is also very important. This act allowed the Europeans to acquire property and wealth in India. So this was also very important feature. Earlier, Europeans were not allowed to acquire property and wealth in India, but acquire property, acquire land. Okay, so Europeans were allowed to acquire land, property, wealth in India. Okay, and this marked the beginning of colonization of India. Okay, earlier the Europeans were not allowed to buy property, okay, immovable property like land in India. But by this act, all those restrictions which prohibited the Europeans to purchase property, to acquire property, acquire land in India. Okay, this act provided opportunity. This act clearly mentioned that the Europeans could acquire property in India in future. Okay, so this is also, so the colonization of India started by this act. Okay, colonization of, why? Earlier Europeans were not allowed to acquire property, acquire land in India, but by this act they were permitted constitutionally to acquire land, property, wealth in India. Okay, and in reality this was the beginning of colonization of India. Okay, I hope this point is clear. Now, the next important provision of this act was the Governor General of Bengal. Okay, the Governor General of Bengal. Okay, the Governor General of Bengal became the Governor General of India. Okay, the Governor General of Bengal was made Governor General of India. This was also one of the most important provision of this act. Okay, so the Governor General of Bengal became the Governor of India by the Charter Act 1833. Okay. Now, the next provision was before the passage of this act, the Indians were not allowed in public services. But now this act opened the door of civil services for Indians. Okay? This act opened the door for Indians. Okay? Opened the door. And this was mentioned in the section 87. Section 87 of 1833. Okay? Of Charter Act. Of Charter Act 1833. Section 87 of Charter Act 1833 declared that Indians could take part in civil services. Okay, this was one of the most important provision of Charter Act 1833. Before the passage of this act, Indians were not allowed in civil services, but now by this act, okay, by this act, the civil services were made open for Indians. Okay, and opens for the Indians. The next provision of this act was slavery was abolished. Slavery was abolished by this act, and we have discussed in detail about the abolition of slavery. Okay, Act number 5. Okay, Act 5 of 1843. Okay, this act abolished the system of slavery from India, but it was mentioned in the Charter Act 1833. Okay, now the next important was a law commission was formed, established by a law commission. First time in India, a law commission was formed for the codification of laws passed in India. Okay, so a law commission was appointed. Okay, this act, okay, by this act, law commission was appointed, a law commission was formed, and the main purpose of this law commission was to codify the laws passed in India. Okay, and apart from that, a new member, okay, a new member which was related to law was appointed in Governor General Council. This is also very important. A new member was added to the Governor General of Council. We all know when it was formed, a Council of Governor General was formed by which act? Regulating Act 1773. Okay, and that time there were 4 members, and all name of all the members you all have to learn. Okay, Montserrat was there, Philip Francis was there, Clavering was there. Okay, Worwell was there. So a new member which was related to law. Okay, so a law. Okay, so a new member was added to Governor General Council. Okay, and the new member was master in law. Okay, now this new member of this law member, the new member which was law member, had all the rights. Okay, his work was fully legislative. Okay, his work was fully legislative, but he was not allowed to vote. A new member was law member. A new member which was added to the Governor General of Council was from the field of law. He had legislative power, but he was not allowed to vote. Okay, just like the Attorney General of India. Okay, he had a right to take part in the proceeding of parliament. Okay, he can be allowed to sit in any of the house, but he had no right to vote. Just like that, a new member which was added to the Governor General Council had all the power in the field of legislation, but he were not allowed to vote. Okay, and Lord Macaulay was the first member as a law was appointed as a law member. Okay, Lord Macaulay. Lord Macaulay. Okay, Lord Macaulay was the first law member in the Governor General Council, and he was also the head of Law Commission. Okay, he was also the head of Law Commission, which was first time formed in India by this act, and this Law Commission was formed for the codification of the law passed in India. Okay, now so the next important provision of this act was this act by this act centralization of, okay, legislative centralization okay. Now this act, okay, also brought about legislative centralization in India. The laws made by Governor General and its council was applicable to all the presidencies. Okay, so centralization of legislation was started by this Charter Act 1833. Before this, the Bombay Presidency, the Calcutta Presidency, Madras Presidency, all presidency had a power to make their own laws. But now the laws made by the Governor General's Council was applicable to all presidencies or all that over the territory of East India Company. So this was the beginning of legislative centralization and the seed of this legislative centralization was sown by the Charter Act 1833. Okay, so these all are the important provisions of the Charter Act 1833. Okay, so today we have discussed about the Charter Act 1793. Okay, and there were only 2 or 3 provisions in the Charter Act 1793. The first provision was extended the company's trade monopoly for the further next 20 years. The second was a code was framed for all the legislation passed by the Bengal presidency, and third, okay, all members of home government were in future, okay, paid from the salaries of all the members of the home government, okay, were paid from, earlier it was paid from the British Treasury, but now this act, the Act of 1783 made clearly mentioned that in future the salaries would be paid from the Indian revenue. So this was the 1793. Charter Act 1813, the provisions were, the first of all, extended the trading rights, trade monopoly for 20 years, ended the trade monopoly, but the company retained, by the act of this, the company retained the trade monopoly in trade of free trade as well as trade with China. Okay, Indian trade was opened for all Britishers, all British companies. Okay, by the Act of 1813, 1 lakh rupees, okay, was first time the British Parliament allotted for the promotion of education, and apart from that, by the Act of 1813, the Christian missionaries were allowed to go to India and settle there. Okay, for this they were given license by the British government. Okay, and this was the beginning of the purpose of this license was the expansion of Christianity. Okay, China, and in trade and in the tea trade and Indian trade. Okay, so trade monopoly rights of company was ended. Second was the European, all the restrictions. Earlier there was a restriction. There were restrictions on the immigrants of or from Europe, but this act allowed the Europeans to acquire land, property in India, and actually the colonization of India begins from after the passage of this act, with the passage of this act. Okay, the next provision was the section 87 of Charter Act 1833 declared that in future Indians were allowed in public services. Okay, so the public service was open for Indians by this act. Okay, apart from that, a law commission was appointed. Okay, and the purpose of this law commission was codification of law. Okay, apart from this, a new member, okay, was appointed in Governor General Council, and the member was from the field of law. So a law member was added to the Governor General Council. Okay, and Macaulay was the first law member. Okay, and the law member had all the rights in the legislation activities, but he was not allowed to vote. Okay, and this law commission and the law member was made the head of this law commission, and Law Macaulay was the first law commissioner. Okay, so these all were the provision of, and we all know slavery. By this act, okay, the government decided to end slavery in India. Okay, so abolition of slavery, okay, was also mentioned as a provision of the Charter Act in 1833. So we have discussed all these three acts. Tomorrow we will discuss about the other act passed by British Parliament. Okay, I hope it is clear to all of you. Okay, now I am going to wind this class. Tomorrow we will continue the same topic. This topic is little bit lengthy but very important for pre-examination. Okay, till then, goodbye and take care.